Whew. So white privilege is a term that it's almost as amorphous as racism, right? Because so in 1989, Wellesley professor by the name of Peggy McIntosh wrote an article called The White Knapsack, in which she outlined 52 instances that were just easier for white folks. Some of those things were going into a grocery store and seeing other people who look like me, going up to a manager and seeing somebody who looked like me, just sort of different things. And then she runs you through a checklist. So that term of white privilege actually came from her, a white woman in 1989. And her explicit point there was to say that for white people, it's not that you didn't work hard, not that you didn't earn your things, not that life wasn't difficult for you, but your race and how you look was not one of those things. That was her point, and that is what is meant by white privilege. White privilege isn't to say that every white person who has a college degree didn't work hard, or people who have earned their stuff didn't earn it, right? Her point is that your race and how you looked was not an obstacle towards getting those things. And it's very important, again, to understand the history of this country, where for a long time, Germans were not considered white. Irish were not considered white, right? Poles were not considered white. Jewish folks were not considered white. But white is an amorphous system that will allow people to come in if they adhere to the rules of white supremacy. So if you don't adhere to the rules of white supremacy, you're expelled from whiteness, right? But if you adhere to the rules of white supremacy, you're allowed to be there, right? I don't know how many people know who Candace Owens is, but she is a Black woman who is getting a bigger and bigger platform because she has adhered to the rules of white supremacy, right? I'm forgetting his name now, but the sheriff in 2016, who was a big part of Trump's campaign with the cowboy hat, African-American sheriff in Milwaukee, Sheriff Clark, Black guy, Black sheriff, allowed into whiteness because he adhered to the rules of white supremacy. So in terms of what to teach kids of privilege, in terms of what to teach white kids, I would say you teach them the same things that you teach strong kids, right? Like if a kid is 6'4", 250 pounds in 8th grade and is physically stronger, by nothing of his doing came out of his mom's womb a manimal, what would you teach that kid? Right? You would teach that kid, use your strength for good. You would teach that kid, help other people. If somebody has heavy groceries, pick them up and take them up 4 flights of stairs, right? You would teach that kid, develop your body so that you can use your body for a greater good on the back end, right? So the same things that you teach a kid who came out of his mother's womb, again, because of the randomness of genetics, with disproportionate privilege and disproportionate ability, you would teach that kid to develop that ability to serve other people, right? And it's the same thing with white privilege, right? How do you use the 3, 4 aces in your hand to help make the game better? Not to necessarily win the game, but how do you make it better for everybody? You're going to find a ton of really fascinating history lessons and stories about African-American and people of color who are scientists. Do you all know that the first person to perform successful heart surgery was a Black man in, I believe, Nashville, Tennessee? Really weird nugget. Hopefully that's useful for somebody on this call. My wife is laughing because she's like, how do you know that? Because I read, I like it. And I think the story about melanin and evolution is super cool, and it's intersectional, and I would bring in a bunch of different folks to actually have a conversation around that. I think it'd be really interesting to bring in a historian to talk about the evolution of the history of science, right? So how people sort of have always had this instinct to classify things and people, and classified things and people in different ways, right? You could talk about like phrenology. For a long time, people thought that the correlation between somebody's brain size and cranium size correlated with their intelligence. Turns out that's not true, but a lot of people believe it for a long time. That'd be a really interesting piece to bring into the classroom, right? And talk about, here's where we think about science is today. Here's where they thought science was 100 years ago. What do you think they'll think science is 100 years from now, right? Because science is a constant process of investigation and learning, and incremental learning at that. So I think that'd be a really fun lesson, and I'm happy to connect offline, because I think it'd be a really cool way to tie in a bunch of stuff. If I had to explain race and racism to a 3-year-old, I would say there were a group of people who wanted, who had a lot of toys and wanted more toys, candy, whatever it is. And they were mean in really creative ways. And they used their gifts of creativity that we would hope they had used for good. And they used their creative gifts and their brains and all of their talents that could be used to help people to take things that were not theirs. And then on top of that, blamed the people that they stole from and said it was their fault. And then created a lie to cover that up. And then I would talk through how that would make you feel. Have you done that to your brother? Has your brother done that to you? Have you done that to your sister? Has your sister done that to you? And one of the pieces of the lie is to assign value to how a certain group of people look versus another group of people solely based on the color of their skin. And that's wrong. In our family, we don't believe that. We believe that every person is inherently, and that's a big fancy word for just because who they are, every person is very valuable and deserves all of the opportunities and beauty that life has to offer.